days ago, probably about a week ago now, and I saw a story on the news that piqued my interest. Actually, it was Rob who piqued my interest when he heard the news, and I was working on the computer or something, not paying much attention to it. And he all of a sudden said, "Sandy, Utah, didn't you used to live in Sandy, Utah?" I said, "Yes, I did. What's going on?" You might have seen the story on the news. It was a young man and his wife. They had a 5-year-old little girl. And in the middle of the night one night, they heard the little girl's voice. And they went out to hear what was wrong, and there was a stranger in their house who was taking the little girl out of the home to kidnap her. Talk about a harrowing, scary experience for any parent. The stepfather, without thinking a word about it, not even his real child, but loved her as his own, left the house, went out into the yard, chased down the man with his daughter in his arms, and confronted him, demanding his daughter be given back. Miraculously, he convinced the man to give back the daughter, and the guy was caught a couple of blocks away down the road. Now, fear is never a good thing for us. At least we don't think it's okay to be afraid. But the reality is, safety is something we value. We like to be safe. And fear sometimes is healthy for us. There is such a thing as a defense mechanism of fear, I think, that keeps us safe in some ways. Case in point, if you ever go to the edge of a canyon and look over, and you get just a little too close, do you get that feeling inside that says, take a step back? Your brain's way of saying, this isn't really a safe space right now. Don't get too close. There is such a thing as healthy fear that keeps us safe. And then there's unhealthy fear that keeps us from opening up and experiencing things that might really enhance our lives in wonderful ways. When it was Rob's birthday one year a while back, when he turned 30, I really wanted to take him skydiving. He's always wanted to skydive. I have no desire to join him in skydiving. If I had been the person who realized that someone would pay good money to have someone else push them out of a flying airplane, I'd be rich. There is a reason why God did not give me wings. Okay? I don't mind flying in the plane, I just have no desire. That is not something I care to flirt with. Now, perhaps I'm closing myself up to something. You know, there might be a real thrill in that, and enjoyment in skydiving that a lot of people have. My fear is perhaps a little unhealthy. I would never do it. The scriptures today talk about fear, and they talk about opening ourselves up and risking safety. Our Thessalonians lesson today, Paul speaks about what we know in theological terms as the eschaton. That is simple terms for the end of time, the end of the world. The end of the world, he says, will be sudden, like a thief in the night. You won't know when it happens, so stay awake, stay sober. Don't be like those who party and then sleep so hard because they're drunk that nothing can awaken them. Be the one who's awake and ready for the coming of the Lord. Always be alert, on guard, and watch, Paul says. Paul thought, like many in his time, that the coming of the Lord was going to be a physical return in his generation. So much so that he told his followers at one point, don't bother getting married unless you burn with desire, because it's better to marry than to burn. But quite frankly, don't bother getting married because we don't need more kids. Just be about the business of building up the kingdom of God. All well and good until they realized that this generation Jesus spoke of his return was not a literal generation. So later he then writes, well, on second thought, I guess Jesus isn't coming back as soon as we thought, so go ahead and have kids, because it might not be right away. And here we are 2,000 years later, and we're still waiting. In the gospel lesson today, Jesus talks a bit about this in the same way, when he tells the story of a landowner who gives 3 of his servants a particular allotment of talents. A talent is an amount of money that's not really specified, but some people say a talent could be up to almost $1 million in their economy. It was quite a bit of money these people were given. 1 talent was given to one man, 2 to another, 5 to another. The man came back many years later, and he was able to recoup what was his. The man with 5 talents had traded wisely and had 10. The man with 2 had done the same and had 4. The man with 1 afraid of his master, buried his talent, did nothing with it, and then at the end said, here you go, I saved it for you. And the man was furious. Yes, you saved it for me, but I invested in you and you did absolutely nothing with it. Now, what's the purpose of this story? Because Jesus, again, is talking about the kingdom of God. He's talking about the end of days. He's talking with his disciples in this whole series of readings about what the kingdom of God will be like. And this is what he chooses to say. The story is not so much about the money. There was plenty of money. It was really about the fear. You see, the man was so afraid of his master that he was paralyzed to use what God gave him. What the master, the God in the story, what the master had given to him. And so he just buried it and kept it hidden to give it back to him just as he'd received. He didn't have enough trust to use the gift and trust that the master would understand. You see in the story, I think there's an undercurrent about the trust the man had in his master. And if we read that story as the way Jesus intended it, as a parable, with God as the master, is there anyone in our lives that can be trusted more than God? Do we see God as a person who is expecting the worst from us and can't wait to trip us up when we don't do it right? I really believe that God does want the best for us. I believe that God is one who is above all else trustworthy, and that there's nothing in this life that God won't love us and see us through. But when the beginning of our faith foundation is one of fear, and not one of trust and understanding and grace, when we don't see God as one who is trustworthy above all else, it's really difficult. It's difficult for us to offer our gifts, to offer ourselves, and take a risk. Because safety is not comfortable if you don't feel like you can trust the thing that makes you safe. Today's readings teach us, I think, a few things about the reality of discipleship today. Discipleship expects a lot of us. God expects a lot of us. Jesus said, those to whom much is given, much will be expected. Discipleship means that we're expected to give. We're expected to use our talents. We're expected not to hide ourselves away and hide those things in our lives that have been given to us for the good of our community and for the good of our world, but to trust and let down the defense mechanisms enough to offer ourselves to God and to the world around us. And to trust that God will keep us safe in the midst of that. If there's one thing the one-talent man had that he was very good at, it's making excuses, wasn't it? He loved to make excuses. I was afraid of you because I knew that you're a man who reaps where you sow and you gather where you don't scatter, and I knew that you would be upset, so I just wanted to hide it and give it back to you because I'm afraid. I remember reading a story recently about a mediocre golfer. Not the best golfer in the world, but he got up to the tee and he took his strike, he took a swing as best he could and whiffed the ball. Nothing but air. So he took a second stab at it, again whiffed the ball. Nothing but air. Stepped back and stretched a little bit, and the whole crowd's watching him. It's a pro golf tour. Not a great pro golf tour, but a pro golf tour. Steps back up to the green, takes his club, winds back, whiffs the ball a third time, and the crowd is aghast. And they begin to snicker behind his back just a little bit, and he turns around and he says to them, "This is the toughest course I've ever played." And it wasn't the course that had anything to do. He was, of course, just joking. The course had nothing to do with the way he was playing. Just like the master had nothing at all to do with the reason why the man wouldn't share his talents. He didn't do anything with his talent to invest or to use it because of his own fear that kept him from being all that God intended for him to be. We finally realize that radical discipleship means risk. Facing a life with Christ means facing risk and letting down the things that may be a little fearful for us. Things we've never done before. Giving in new ways, both financially and spiritually, emotionally, in service to the church and to the world. Excuse me. Discipleship necessitates risk. Jesus said, if you love your life for my sake and the sake of the gospel, if you love it enough to lose it, you'll find it. But if you love it enough to keep it for yourself, you're going to lose it. The reality is that discipleship implies risk, doesn't it? It implies trusting God enough to step out in faith in new and wondrous ways. And that can be uncomfortable. But it means knowing that maybe we're not comfortable doing something new for the very first time. But we know that God, who is trustworthy, can see us through. There's an abbey off the coast of Brittany in France called Our Lady of the Risk. And the reason it's called Our Lady of the Risk is because those who founded the abbey were very, very clear. There is nothing that you can say of the Virgin Mary if not that she was a woman of risk. Risking risking her own life, risking her marriage to Joseph, risking her well-being, risking her family and her status in her community. Her entire future was at risk because she dared to say yes to a life with Christ. For that very reason, she knew, and she taught us, that loving Jesus means risking. And it means loving enough to reach out in new ways. I showed this video today to you because I think it's important for us. I wanted to show that ours is a church that has loved enough to risk, that has let down the safety guards around us and our faith to say that we were the first church to ordain an African American person, the first church to ordain a woman, 60 years before women got the vote. We were the first church to ordain an openly gay man in 1973, decades before other churches would follow suit. This church, I believe, is a church that can be, and in many ways is, prophetic. Because you see, prophetic voices don't have to be big and powerful ones. Sometimes prophetic voices can be quiet and small ones. Our church, I think, is a prophetic church in this community that's risking to the point of being prophetic, to the point of speaking a word of truth we know to be God's witness in this world. That there is an extravagant welcome and a grace for all people. That's very risky, and we've taken hits for it. The reality is, it's who we're called to be. And sometimes risking is what God calls us to do. There's a story of Clarence Jordan he was a Southern Baptist pastor back in the 1940s, who started a community, a vision he had called Koinonia Farm. He envisioned a place where black people and white people would live together in community, and they would together build a community of love and justice and compassion and truth. Everything went well, except it was in America's Georgia in the 1940s, and society in Georgia was not ready to accept an integrated community like America's. So the Koinonia Farm had problems. People picketed and boycotted. They wouldn't buy the produce from their farm that the community was growing to support themselves. And then about 10 years later, the Ku Klux Klan came in, and they burnt Koinonia Farm to the ground. And the only people who were left, everyone else scattered, the only people who were left were Jordan and his wife and an African American family who were bold enough to stay. And one day, the story is told, true or not, that Jordan was out in the field turning over the soil with his hoe. He was rebuilding, faith in the future, starting all over again. And a reporter came up to him and said, "Pastor Jordan, you got 2 of those fancy PhDs, but it seems like nobody wants you here, and everyone else has left. Tell me, how successful do you think that Koinonia Farm has really been?" Jordan stopped tilling the ground for just a minute, and he looked, the story says, at the reporter, and he said, "Sir, you don't know much about being Christian, do you? Because for being Christians, it's not about being successful. It's about being faithful." The point of that parable and the story for me in the gospel today is this. Each and every one of us has a gift. We have a talent. We have something to offer to ourselves, to our families, to our communities, to our church, and to our world. Every one of us has something we've been given. Maybe we think our gift isn't worth offering. Maybe we think our talent isn't worth having. Maybe we think that perhaps other people have told us that we're not welcome to offer that gift because even though we are gifted, they're not ready to hear it, or we're not welcome, or we're not worthy enough to give that gift. But you know what? Those are lies. In the kingdom of God, everyone is talented by God's gift and design. Everyone has something to give. Everyone has a part to play. And you know what? In the kingdom of God, we know the words of Clarence Jordan all too well. When you understand what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, it's not about being successful at all. It's about being faithful. I can run to, and nothing